بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the 1967 war between the Arab nations and Israel. And we spoke about how that war was a great loss for the Muslims, and how Israel, within a short period of 6 days, was able to capture land from Jordan and from Egypt and from Syria. From Jordan, they captured the West Bank, and that includes East Jerusalem. It includes Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. From Egypt, they were able to capture Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. And from Syria, they were able to take the Jolan Heights. So it was a great loss for the Arab nations. And it was really a tragedy for the Muslim Ummah. So this was the 6-day war of 1967. Now, one thing that did happen, one positive effect that happened after that war of 1967 is that the Muslim Ummah then began to finally wake up. They began to wake up regarding the reality of the situation, and they began to turn more to Al-Islam. Right? They started to realize that, the different regimes of the different nations were leading them on, making false promises. They started to finally realize this and wake up. And a lot of awareness began to spread after 1967. And a lot of new Islamic movements then came up, right? There were many Islamic movements before that. Since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there were Islamic movements that came up, but none of them really had much of a strong effect. But now after 1967, the people started turning more to Islam. Now, Israel, after this 6-day war and after the huge losses that were inflicted upon the Arab nations, Israel became very arrogant. They thought, look what we did, look what we can do, look at our power. They became very arrogant, and they announced just a few weeks after the end of that war, they announced on June 27th, 1967, the unification of East and West Jerusalem. So up to that point, before 1967, East Jerusalem, which includes Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, that was part of Jordan. But now, after the 6-day war, Israel took over East Jerusalem. So now they said, we are going to unify East and West Jerusalem. So Jerusalem as a whole now, it is part of Israel, and they declared it as the eternal, non-negotiable capital of Israel, the religious capital of Israel. Now, after this, as we mentioned, the Islamic movements started to gain more traction. And there were actually even some movements that were not Islamic that also started to gain traction. There were some movements that were actually run by non-Muslim Palestinians who had a stake in this as well. So there was one organization that is known as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, also known as the PFLP for short. Right? So this organization, they started actually carrying out hijacking operations after 1967. Right? They focused on aircraft, and they hijacked a number of planes, and a lot of guerrilla operations started within Palestine. right? So this organization, the PFLP, they actually averaged about 12 different operations per month, right? It was guerrilla warfare, so not really organized, but they carried out a number of operations on an average of 12 operations per month. So you could see that they were quite active. Now, after the war of 1967, the Arab leaders, they gathered in July of 1967. So the 1967 war took place in June. The next month in July, Arab leaders, they gathered in Khartoum, in Sudan, and they had a conference where they discussed the situation in the Middle East, and they discussed the situation of Israel, and they discussed the consequences of the 6-day war. And this conference, it became known as Mu'tamar al-La'at. Mu'tamar al-La'at. The conference of no's. Right? Because they said, La lil-sulh, la lil-tafawud, la lil-istislam. They said, no peace, no negotiations, and no surrender. Right? So these no resolutions, because of that it became known as the Conference of No. Mu'tamar al-La'at. Right? But basically it was just talk. It didn't really turn out to be anything. The UN Security Council then met in November of that same year, on November 12th, 1967. And they actually issued a number of resolutions mandating Israel to withdraw from lands that it had occupied in 1967. The new lands that they took over in 1967, even the UN, they recognized this as illegal occupation, right? So the UN, they ordered, or they issued, they didn't order, they don't order Israel to do anything, right, the UN, but they issued a resolution mandating Israel to withdraw from lands that it occupied in 1967, right? And from the wording of that resolution, one of the conditions was, one of the mandates was وجوب انسحاب إسرائيل من أراضي احتلتها, that the obligation of Israel to withdraw from lands that it has occupied. So the Arabs, they were not happy with this wording, right? Because the wording, if you know Arabic, وجوب انسحاب إسرائيل من أراضي احتلتها, that it is mandated for Israel to withdraw from lands that it has occupied. So this does not necessarily apply to all of the land that Israel has occupied. It only applies to some of the lands that it has occupied. So they wanted to put the word al in front of aradi. They wanted to change it to وجوب انسحاب إسرائيل من الأراضي التي احتلتها. Because al-aradi, it means all of the lands. There's no exception. That Israel should withdraw from all of the lands that it has taken over and occupied. So the UN resolution was worded without that al. And the Arabs, they said no. It has to apply to all of the lands, so you have to add al. Right? So there was a big argument between the Arabs and the UN regarding the wording of this resolution, and it became known as Ma'arakat al-Alif Lam. Ma'arakat al-Alif wal-Lam. That the war of al-Alif wal-Lam, that we need to add that al there so that it applies to all of those lands, right? So these were some of the steps or the diplomatic talks that were going on after the war of 1967. But in any case, the United Nations, the UN, they really wanted the state of war to end, and they issued another resolution saying that all of the states in the region, all of the countries in the Middle East, their sovereignty should be recognized and respected. So what did that really mean? They said all of the states in the Middle East, but the other states of the Middle East, they already had known sovereignty. And they were already recognized. So by saying this, they're saying basically that Israel should be recognized by everyone and its sovereignty should be respected. They worded it in a way saying all of the states of the Middle East, their sovereignty should be recognized and respected. But what they really meant by that is that everyone has to recognize the sovereignty and accept the state of Israel, right? So these were some of the developments that happened after the war of 1967. All right. So as we mentioned, after 1967, a number of movements came up. Some of them were Islamic movements, others were nationalistic movements, not necessarily led by Muslims, right? There were a number of movements that sprung up. In the year 1968, there was a major battle that took place that was known as the Battle of Karama, right? There was a village in Jordan that is known as Karama. And in 1968, the Israeli military attacked that village. So the Palestinian resistance organization, Al-Fath, which still exists today, right? The Palestinian resistance organization, Al-Fath, alongside with Jordanian forces from the Jordanian military, they successfully defended the village of Al-Karama. They successfully defended it from Israeli aggression. And the Israelis, they had to retreat. So alhamdulillah, with this victory, this was kind of somewhat of a restoration of the dignity of the Arabs after the humiliating defeat that they faced in 1967. They proved that, alhamdulillah, they are still able to fight and they are still able to have victories over the Israelis. So they were victorious against the Israelis, and the Israelis were not able to take over the village of Al-Karama. As we mentioned, during this period there was a great increase in guerrilla warfare operations. These different militant groups attacking Israeli camps, attacking Israeli military bases. This is something that increased a lot in the aftermath of the 1967 war. So Al-Fath was responsible for many of these guerrilla operations. In the year 1968, Al-Fath and another militant group known as Mu'askarat al-Shuyukh, right? These two groups, they collaborated with each other in 1968 in an operation that was known as Amaliyat al-Hizam al-Akhdar, the Green Belt Operation, right? So Al-Fath, in cooperation with Mu'askarat al-Shuyukh, these two militant organizations, they attacked 3 Zionist military camps at one time. And they were able to kill a number of Zionist soldiers. They were able to injure a number of Zionist soldiers as well. They destroyed a club for Jewish soldiers. They destroyed a number of Israeli military vehicles. They destroyed a number of Israeli fuel stations, right? So this was an attack that took place in 1968. And it was a collaboration between Al-Fath and Mu'askarat al-Shuyukh against the Israeli military. So it was somewhat of a success, right? And most of these operations, their base was either in Jordan or Lebanon, right? So Al-Fath and these other groups, their bases were in Jordan and Lebanon. But as for Egypt, the regime of Jamal Abdel Nasser started cracking down a lot on anyone taking part in these movements, right? They didn't want this militant activity taking place with Egypt as a base. All right, the next year, 1969, Al-Fath was able to gain leadership in the official Palestinian Liberation Organization. So the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that was the face of Palestine in the international realm, the PLO, right? So Al-Fath was able to gain leadership in the PLO in 1969, and Yasser Arafat became the leader of the PLO. So he became the face of Palestine on the international circuit. And guerrilla warfare continued to be used as a technique for the resistance. All right. Also in 1969, there was a very bad attack on Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa by an Australian Zionist extremist. This man was from Australia. So he came into Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa in 1969 and he set fire to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So a lot of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa was damaged, and included in the damage was the historic mimbar of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. And we spoke about that in previous lessons. It was actually built, or it was commissioned by Nuruddin al-Zinki. Right? He had it built, but he did not live to see the liberation of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. But then during the time of Salahuddin, Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa was liberated, and Salahuddin brought that mimbar into Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And it remained the actual mimbar of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa that the Imams would use and give khutbah from, right, for centuries. From the time of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, from the liberation of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa during the time of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi until 1969, it was actually used as the mimbar that the khatibs of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa would use. Then in 1969, this Australian Jew, Dennis Michael Rohan, he comes and he sets fire to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and included in the damage is the mimbar of Salahuddin. So it had to be removed in 1969. So this fire, it really sparked outrage in the Islamic world, right? So after this fire, there was another gathering of Arab leaders in the gathering that was known as the Islamic and Arab Summit. And these leaders, they got together in this summit, and their discussions led to the establishment of the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which still exists today. But at that time, it was called the Organization of the Islamic Conference. Then later on, they changed the name to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, right? They issued many declarations, the OIC. They would get together, they would issue many declarations, many resolutions, but they did not really have any executive power, right? They could make all of these resolutions, make all of these decisions, but they did not really have the power to implement anything. So most of the resolutions, it was just ink on paper, right? With no practical effect. All right. The militant operations continued. These operations against the Israeli occupation. And by the year 1970, there was an average of 270 operations against the Israelis every month taking place. So there's a lot of activity from these resistance groups against the Israeli occupation. So the Arab and the Islamic world began to support these militant groups. They began to support Mu'askarat al-Shuyukh and al-Fath, right? And this Palestinian resistance movement, mainly based in Jordan, it reached its peak during this period, 1970 or the early 1970s. But the Jordanian government was not liking what was going on. So these Palestinian resistance fighters were basing their operations from Jordan and attacking the Israelis. And this led to tension between the Jordanian government and these Palestinian militants. And during this time period, there was actually an assassination attempt on the king of Jordan, King Hussein. Right? There was an assassination attempt on King Hussein, and it was blamed on the Palestinians. It was blamed on the Palestinians. Now, around this same period, in September of 1970, the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they focus on air warfare, right? So what they did in 1970, September of 1970, this was a huge event. In September of 1970, they hijacked a number of Western civilian aircrafts. They hijacked a number of planes. So they hijacked TWA Flight 741 from Frankfurt to New York. It was supposed to fly from Frankfurt Airport in Germany to New York City, but it was hijacked by members of the PFLP, and they forced that plane to divert and land in Jordan. So it flew from Frankfurt to Jordan instead of flying to New York. Also, they hijacked on the same day Swiss Air Flight 100 that was scheduled to fly from Zurich, Switzerland to New York as well. But they hijacked that plane and they forced it to fly into Jordan as well. They also hijacked Pan Am Flight 93 that was supposed to go from Amsterdam in the Netherlands to New York. But that was diverted. Originally, they wanted to take that plane to Jordan as well, but the pilots were able to convince the hijackers that the place where you want to land in Jordan, this plane is too big to land in that space. So instead of flying it to Jordan, they flew it initially to Beirut, where they refueled, and then they flew it to Cairo in Egypt. So the PFLP, their objective in hijacking these planes was to demand that a number of Palestinian militants that were being held in prison in Germany and Switzerland and England, and also in Israel, they should be released. Right? So they basically wanted to use the passengers on those planes as hostages and as bargaining chips. And their demand was that these Palestinian militants in Germany, Switzerland, England, and Israel should be released within a period of 72 hours. So negotiations went on. A lot of negotiations went on. The United States got involved in the negotiations as well. Richard Nixon was the president of the US at that time. He got involved in the negotiations as well, right? So negotiations were going on, and Israel launched a number of heavy bombardments on Jordan, because they said like Jordan is the place where these groups launched these activities from, right? So Israel started attacking Jordan. They launched heavy bombardments on Jordan, targeting the camps of those militant organizations, and also targeting Jordanian airports, Jordanian bridges, and trying to basically damage the Jordanian infrastructure. So King Hussein, he was very upset about this. And he was basically saying that these Palestinian militant organizations are basically destroying Jordan with the hands of Israel. By launching their attacks from Jordan, by having their bases in Jordan, this is causing Israel to attack Jordan. So King Hussein decided to crack down on the armed Palestinian presence in Jordan. He said none of these militant groups, none of these armed militant groups can use Jordan as their base anymore. Right? So he instituted martial law to stop these Palestinian militant groups from continuing with their operations. And this led to the well-known events of September 1970, which became known as Black September. September 1970 became known as Black September due to a number of armed clashes between the Jordanian army under the command of King Hussein and Palestinian militant forces. So now the Palestinian militant forces in Jordan are actually fighting with the official Jordanian army. And of course the Jordanian army, they are more well equipped, right? They're more well organized. So this led to a great massacre of Palestinians in Jordan at the hands of the Jordanian army, right? There were around 3,000 Palestinians that were killed. Refugee camps were destroyed. Militant camps were destroyed. The camps of Mu'askarat al-Shuyukh were destroyed and closed, right? So this was a huge event that took place in September of 1970, and that month became known as Black September because of this. So these clashes, of course, led to the expulsion of these militant groups from Jordan. And Jordan was a very important base that they had because of its location, right? The border, the extensive border of Jordan and Israel, that was a very strategic place for these militant groups to have their bases. So now they're expelled from these places, and it makes things more difficult for them. On September 27th, 1970, the Egyptian president, Jamal Abdel Nasser, he summoned the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, and also Jordan's king, King Hussein. He called them to Cairo to broker a settlement, to stop these clashes and to stop what was going on. But the next day, September 28th, 1970, Jamal Abdel Nasser, he had a heart attack and he died. He died the very next day. And Anwar Sadat took over the reins of power in Egypt after the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser. Now, with the death of Jamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, the sense of Arab nationalism, it became weak. It became weaker, right? Jamal Abdel Nasser was a symbol of Arab nationalism. So when he died, the sense of Arab nationalism became weaker, but the Islamic wave surged and became stronger, right? And a group actually emerged, a new group emerged. A new group emerged that was known as Black September. They named themselves after that September. So the group actually was known as Black September. So this organization, the organization of Black September, they emerged and they were very much against the Jordanian government because of the Jordanian government's expulsion of the Palestinian militants earlier. So one of the things that this group did, Black September, is that when the Jordanian Prime Minister Wasfi Attal, when he was visiting Cairo, he was visiting Egypt, members of this Palestinian militant movement, Black September, they arranged for the assassination of Wasfi Attal, the Jordanian Prime Minister, while he was in Cairo. This same organization, Black September, in 1972, they took the Israeli Olympic team hostage in the Munich Olympics of 1972. There was an Israeli Olympic team that was there in Munich, and the Black September group, they took the Israeli Olympic team hostage in 1972, and there were some negotiations that went on, and there was an attempt to free the hostages. But when this attempt failed, all of the members of this Israeli Olympic team, they were killed. They were all killed. That was in Munich in 1972. So all of these events that were taking place led to a shift in the conflict, right? After the doors to these militant operations were closed in Jordan, then most of the activity shifted to Lebanon. Lebanon became the main center for the militant operations against the Israeli occupation. And the Lebanese army didn't like this, right? The Lebanese army was not happy with this, but the Lebanese army was not strong enough to really put a stop to it. The Jordanian army was stronger. They were able to put a stop to it. The Lebanese army did not have the strength really to put a stop to it. So these militant operations continued to take place from Lebanon. Some of the operations still continued from Jordan, but not to the extent that they were taking place before. And many of them, the main source became Lebanon. The main base for these operations became Lebanon. So what did Israel do as a response to this? They started to bomb Lebanon, and they still bomb Jordan as well. And they bombed innocent civilians in Lebanon and Jordan. And Israel is known to do that even today. They don't care about just striking military targets. They don't care about killing civilians, right? So sometimes they even aim for civilians. Not sometimes. That's the main thing that they do. They aim for killing as many innocent civilians as possible. So that was their MO back in the day, and it still continues to be their way today. So they bombed innocent civilians in Lebanon and in Jordan. They would target factories, target bridges, target power stations, right? So this led to a lot of pressure on Lebanon and in Jordan. Now, the PFLP, they continued with their activities, and they launched an armed attack on the Lud airport, and they killed 31 Israelis and they injured 80 more. In response to this, Israel executed an operation involving a naval landing on the coast of Beirut in Lebanon, and this is April 1973. So a special armed group entered Beirut, and they reached the headquarters of Al-Fatah in Beirut, and they assassinated 3 senior leaders of Al-Fatah organization. They assassinated Muhammad Yusuf al-Najjar, who was the foreign minister of the PLO. They assassinated Kamal Nasser, who was the spokesman, and they assassinated Kamal Adwan, who was one of the leaders of the organization. So 3 main guys. The Israelis, they were able to reach them and assassinate them. Now, during this time in Egypt, the new president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, he began preparing to liberate Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula that was taken over by Israel from Egypt in 1967. As we mentioned, in 1967, the Israelis, they took the West Bank from Jordan, they took the Golan Heights from Syria, and they took Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. So now, Anwar Sadat, he began making a plan to liberate Sinai, to get it back, the Sinai Peninsula, from Israel. Because Israel was preoccupied at this time dealing with the militant activity that was taking place from Lebanon. They were busy with that. So Anwar Sadat saw this as an opportunity to focus on regaining control of the Sinai Peninsula. So Anwar Sadat went into discussions with Syria. Egypt and Syria, they're co-planning this operation. They decided, Egypt and Syria jointly decided to plan an operation to jointly attack Israel at the same time, to liberate Sinai and Gaza, and also to liberate the Golan Heights for Syria. So Egypt and Syria together, they decided to work together. Now Jordan and Lebanon were not included in this plan. This was Egypt and Syria who planned this. Jordan and Lebanon were not included in this plan. Syria would have a harder time, right? Because the Golan Heights, it's a strategic center. The elevation is very high with mountains, and it's not easy to penetrate. So Israel was confident that Syria would not be able to reclaim Golan from them. But as for Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, it's open, right? And it could easily be infiltrated. So Israel knew this, that's a land that can easily be infiltrated. So as soon as they took it over in 1967, Israel wanted to put barriers in place to protect it from being retaken by the Egyptians. So during the occupation of Sinai by Israel from 1967 up to 1973, Israel constructed a defense line. They constructed basically barriers to protect the Sinai Peninsula from being infiltrated. So this defensive line was known as the Bar Lev line, the Bar Lev line. So what did Israel do to protect the Sinai Peninsula from being infiltrated? They created an artificial water barrier after the canal, and they covered it with flammable oil, making it impossible for anyone to swim across. And the width of that was about 200 meters. So that would be impossible to cross over, covered with flammable oil. On the eastern bank, there was a dam that was about 20 meters high with fortified positions, resistant to airstrikes and resistant to artillery. And it was surrounded by mine fields, right? So if there are mines there, then you can't infiltrate that place. And there was also dense barbed wire tank placements for defense, and also they placed anti-aircraft missile along the line. So very heavily fortified, very, very strongly protected, right? So Israel, they thought that nobody can breach this line. It is too strongly fortified. So they thought that it would be impossible for Egypt to retake it. They felt very secure, right? Now, Egypt and Syria were ready to attack in order to gain back these lands. At that time, the king of Saudi Arabia, King Faisal, rahmatullahi alayh, he also encouraged Egypt to move forward with these plans, right? And he used his control of Saudi oil, right, to actually encourage and support Egypt in this endeavor. And he also gave Egypt $6 million to move forward with this plan. So Saudi Arabia supported Egypt, right, to enter into this war and to retake that land, right? So Syria wanted to quickly go forward with this operation. Egypt, they still weren't completely ready yet. They wanted to plan it a little more. But Syria wanted to start this war immediately, right? So after some discussions between Egypt and Syria, Egypt agreed. Due to Syria's urgency, Egypt agreed to basically start the war earlier than they had originally planned. And they started the war to retake these lands on October 6th, 1973. October 6, 1973. And this was the 10th of Ramadan. It was the 10th of Ramadan. So this war became known as the October 6th War. It also is known as the Ramadan War, right? So Egypt and Syria, they launched a surprise attack on Israel. And it was the day of Yom Kippur. It was a holy day for the Israelis, right? So they were busy celebrating and this and that. And it was a surprise attack upon them, right? And Alhamdulillah, there were significant victories, quick victories for the Egyptians, right? That supposedly impenetrable Bar-Lev line fortifying the Sinai Peninsula, Alhamdulillah, the Muslims were able to breach that within just hours, within a few hours, right? They were able to come into Sinai and breach all of that fortification within 18 hours. Within just 18 hours, less than one day. So they crossed the line, and within 40 hours, they regained control of the canal. Right? So Alhamdulillah, this was a good success for the Egyptian military. So the initial decision, the initial plan was to just take control of the canal and the Bar-Lev line, not to take the whole Sinai Peninsula at once. They didn't think that they could do that. But because of how easily the Bar-Lev line fell, how easily they were able to take over the canal, because of that, they decided that we will advance and we will complete the liberation of the Sinai Peninsula. And that is what they decided to do. So this was October of 1973. Inshallah, we'll stop there for today, bi'idhnillah. And inshallah, next week we will continue with the events of that time period, bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullahu khaira wa barakallahu feekum. Wallahu a'lam, sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.